Welcome to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio, the weekly radio news magazine that we put together here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy. We hope you had an amazing Christmas and still basking in it, hopefully, in friendship and family as much as you deem fit. Joining us to kick off this weekend's program is Matt Mitchell, Senior Research Fellow and Director of the Equity Initiative at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University, one of our favorites. And I hope you had an amazing Christmas, Matt, and welcome back to the program.
Thanks so much for having me.
We wanted to talk a little bit about the Certificate of Need laws. I know regular listeners are rolling their eyes saying, not again. Nobody ever talks about Certificate of Need laws, Joe. Well, if this program is the only one, then we have to carry the weight. Now, you have done quite a bit on this through the years, but as we look at COVID-19 and we look back in some ways, look forward in others, first catch us up for those who don't hear the phrase Certificate of Need, as to what it means in Virginia to Virginians, and then let's delve into what has hamstrung us to do in response to COVID-19.
Sure. So a Certificate of Need regulation is a rule that says that if you are a healthcare provider in one of 35 states and D.C., and you want to open or expand your facility, you want to add a hospital bed, or you want to open a drug or substance abuse center, psychiatric services, hospice care facility, you've got to go before a regulator and ask for permission. And in doing so, this is what's very unusual about them. The regulator is not going to ask you what your qualifications are, your safety record, or the adequacy of your facilities, or anything like that. Instead, their entire purpose is to second-guess your assertion that your community could use the service. Mm-hmm. And what's quite controversial, the process can take months, even years, and can cost tens, even hundreds of thousands of dollars. But what's most controversial about it is that sometimes your would-be competitors may sit on the board in some states, and even if they don't, they are invited to come before the board and oppose your application. And the board, in many cases, can deny your application simply if it can be shown that you providing this service will create any competition.
And that's the most amazing part of it, is that that it would be like calling the local McDonald's and saying, hey, somebody wants to open a Wendy's down the road from you. Are you okay with it? And I don't know. When did this become something that regulators thought was a good idea? Were we overrun with hospital facilities at one point in Virginia, and they were all going bankrupt? I mean, I don't know what begins this process to where anyone would ever think that this was a good idea.
Yeah. Well, so the history of it is somewhat interesting. It started in the 60s with New York, but it really got a boost in 1974 when the federal government enacted a statute that withheld federal funds from any states that didn't create a program like this. And, incentives work. Basically, almost every state in the union, I think Louisiana was the holdout, but everybody else adopted a con program right away. And the rationale in that federal statute was interesting. It essentially said that the government has gotten so involved in healthcare that there's healthcare price inflation, and we need to bend the cost curve down because of this government involvement, and so therefore we should have some more government involvement. It's an odd document.
Yeah, we need a case of flattening the curve there.
Exactly. And it's basically a way to ration care. Mm-hmm. And the idea is, well, maybe doctors or providers might be overprescribing and unnecessarily, putting people in through expensive procedures. And so what we should do is eliminate their ability to do that by eliminating expensive equipment. Oh. So it's really just a sort of disguised form of rationing. If you think about any simple model of supply and demand, though, if you restrict supply, you're not going to lower the cost. you're most likely to raise the cost, and that's in fact what we find.
You don't have to have the last name De Beers to understand that. Matt Mitchell on with this. It's really, we see it in housing. We see it in these certificate of needs. As soon as you restrict the amount of something that's available, the price goes up, as it always will. To that end. So when the government comes in and says we're trying to reduce the cost of health care in the 2000s, this isn't the first time they've tried it, and they're actually the ones, I think the phrase Munchausen's by government starts to come to my head.
Yeah, that's right. And, an interesting thing happened in the mid-'80s, though. So there were a couple reforms that were pretty good. One was that there was a Medicare reform that made it so that reimbursements were a little bit more reasonable. Previously, the Medicare reimbursement rate had been called by some cost plus, where essentially it would reimburse providers at whatever they wanted. And so they did some reforms to that, and shortly thereafter, that prompted reform in certificate of need at the federal level. And they did actually remove the federal mandate. But 15 states, and so over the next few decades, 15 states repealed their con laws, but Virginia and 34 others still have them.
So let's circle now to COVID-19 and what I've pointed out, and as we watched, I think it was Inova and the University of Virginia medical centers both laying off or furloughing non-infectious disease treatment staff because there was nobody in the hospitals. Listeners started asking me, but I was reading a report that said hospitals were at capacity. I said, well, no, the infectious disease wings of the hospitals were at capacity. The rest were empty. It becomes a story where the number of rooms to treat patients is really almost the center square of COVID-19 right now. Where are the beds and where are the doctors?
That's right. And I think it really shows how difficult it is for a regulator to take account of all of the possible reasons why you might need extra beds. The rationale behind this is, well, we need to rationally plan. We need to have somebody make a plan for how many hospital beds the state of Virginia should have. And I think this shows that it's really difficult to plan anything without prices, which of course is an important insight from economics. And regulators sometimes miss huge contingencies, like the possibility that you could have, a pandemic, and you might need a whole lot more hospital beds right away. And so a lot of states actually have responded to the COVID crisis by easing or suspending their con laws temporarily. I think, unfortunately, for many, it's too little, too late.
Yeah, absolutely. Where does this, Matt, come into play on things like MedRx and some of these pop-up, quasi, not necessarily emergency rooms, but urgent care businesses that we see in a lot of shopping centers now that seem to, be chains in some cases, but are certainly affording some people some walk-in care and might even be a place where somebody could find vaccines and things like that if they needed it, in COVID-19 and relieve some of the pressure. Do the con laws impact them as well?
They do, and here again, it's interesting to go back to that 1974 statute, because among the things that they said that they wanted to achieve with this federal statute requiring states to adopt con laws was to encourage lower-cost hospital substitutes like ambulatory surgery care. That was specifically in the statute. What's ironic about that is that now some 26 states have a con specifically for ambulatory surgery centers, including Virginia has one of these. So, the whole goal was to encourage lower cost, more convenient modes of care, and now they restrict access to lower cost, more convenient modes of care.
Matt Mitchell is Senior Research Fellow, Director of the Equity Initiative Mercatus Center at George Mason University. You can find on their website, he's got a great piece, Con Laws in 2020, and follow along. There's so much more in there that we're going to get to here on the program. this week. You were mentioning, though, these ambulatory care, these first echelon. I think one of the flashpoints here in Virginia are things like MRI opportunities and the ability to even find out what's going on with a CAT scan equipment and things like that. Correct, Matt?
Yeah, that's right. So Virginia, like a number of other states, also does regulate medical imaging technologies.
Mm-hmm.
So there was an interesting story a few years ago. Dr. Mark Baumel is a radiologist and wanted to use a new technique that had already been proven as effective to do use MRIs. I think it's MRIs. It might be CT scanners to do virtual colonoscopies. The backstory here is that colon cancer is a disease that about 50,000 people die of every year. It has a 90% treatment success rate if you catch it early, but unfortunately, about 50% of those who are at risk don't get any sort of regular screening, and the reason is that it's a pretty invasive procedure. A colonoscopy is not a pleasant thing,
right?
So virtual colonoscopies use medical imaging devices it's just what it sounds like, virtually scan. And then if something shows up, then they can do the more traditional procedure. So this is a really effective way to use technology to screen for a highly treatable disease. He came to Virginia, wanted to buy this medical imaging equipment to start offering the procedure in Virginia, and the con regulators said no. And the reason they said no is, well, there's already these medical imaging devices being used in Northern Virginia. And he said, well, they're not being used for what I want to use them for. And they said, it doesn't matter. They're already there. So it's a perfect example, of how it just stands in the way of common sense care.
And funny enough, the University of Virginia Hospital now offers that exact thing. So funny how that worked out that way.
Yeah.
But years later, here somebody says, "Hey, we could do that ourselves," and with state money and floating that. Unfortunately, this becomes such an obvious instance of why we laughably point to phrases like "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." We see this rife through the economic downturns that are facing all of our economies through COVID-19 anyway. And I'm not sure where these $900 billion funding bills are coming from, but they're getting printed somewhere, Matt. When do we wake up and realize that we're the heroes, not the guys from the government?
Yeah, I have seen instances, in U.S. history when we have collectively woken up to that reality at times. And I think part of it takes some awareness from our friends all across the ideological spectrum. So if you look at the 1970s, people forget this. Ronald Reagan launched the deregulatory movement, but really it was Jimmy Carter who deregulated trucking and airlines, partially deregulated, led to the deregulation of craft brewing. And Reagan did some things to kind of continue that trend, but it was really Carter who started it. And he understood that there was a great deal of evidence that regulations quite often, even though they are sold as something to help consumers, they quite often protect not consumers, but big, powerful businesses from competition. And that comes at the expense, actually, of consumers. So, he saw this with what the Civil Aeronautics Board was doing with airline regulations that limited competition across routes. And estimates showed that it was essentially leading to prices that were twice as high as they otherwise would have been. We had these really convenient facts that the government couldn't regulate routes that were within a state, intrastate routes. And so you had some long intrastate routes like San Diego to San Francisco that were as long or even longer than interstate routes from San Diego to Nevada. And you could compare prices, and you could see that it was twice as expensive as the most regulated route. So anyway, Jimmy Carter, with the help of Ted Kennedy and even Stephen Breyer, who was Ted Kennedy's chief counsel in his Senate committee, they deregulated. And I would like to see our friends on the left, reawaken to this reality that regulations quite often do not serve the consumers that they think they serve. In fact, they have the opposite effect.
There was an interesting moment early in the week where, amidst the debate about the COVID-19 aid bill, both Alyssa Milano and Phil Robertson, not necessarily being notable more than both being celebrities, one of a conservative, one of considerably not, both were saying the same thing about the COVID shutdowns being caused by, the COVID economic problems being caused by the government. Maybe some of the ire in California and New York and some of these places are maybe an indication of that awakening from those on the left, and at least a smart politician of either political party would see this?
Yeah, I would hope so. Really it just comes down to an appreciation for the economic idea that there are actual trade-offs in the world. There's no such thing as a free lunch, and there is some point beyond which when you're trying to shut down the economy, you are causing more harm than benefits. Yeah. It's difficult to know exactly where that point is, which is why economists tend to favor allowing people to make that trade-off for themselves. But it's somewhere. We know it's not. It's not at the point where you have infinitely sealed off all economic activity. It's somewhere before that. You're causing more harm than good.
Matt, as we discuss this, it reminds me, I have a friend who's an affordable housing person in the same way that you've dug into these certificate of need issues. And he once made the point to me, he said, one of the problems with government bodies doing regulatory hearings on affordable housing in his particular milieu, but I think it's applicable in these medical discussions as well, is the one voice not heard in any of these hearings are, in his case, the prospective tenant, and in this particular case, the prospective patients. Nobody is out there saying, hey, let's round up a bunch of prospective patients. You don't know who they are, obviously, but that would certainly, I think, change the tenor of some of these discussions on certificate of need laws if the prospective patient population could be heard in these hearings as well.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And that is, that comes from the way, just the nature of regulations and the nature of getting politically organized. Mm-hmm. So, regulations are, let's face it, often sort of boring. Most people who are impacted by something like a certificate of need law don't even know that it exists. And, it takes a little while to get in and understand the complexities of them. And so the consumers who bear those costs, they're so numerous. There's so many of them. They typically are unaware of them, and even if they are, they're certainly not going to get organized to stop them. The producers who benefit from regulation, they know them very, very well. Hospital executives know everything about how con laws work, and they're very effective at lobbying for them. Mm-hmm. And this is, something that you see over and over again with regulations. You actually saw it at the very dawn of federal regulations. So back in the end of the 19th century, that's when we got the first federal regulatory body, the Interstate Commerce Commission, and it was to regulate railroads. And the sitting attorney general was a man named Richard Olney, and he was a former railwayman. And he wrote to his fellow railwaymen, he said, the commission, he's talking about the ICC, is or made of great use to the railroads. It satisfies the popular clamor for a government supervision of the railroads. At the same time, that supervision is almost entirely nominal. Further, the older such a commission gets to be, the more inclined it will be found to take the business and railroad.
Well, Matt?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. We lost you. A government commission on cell service was just convened.
Sorry. So, essentially he understood that it was best to use the commission. And
Right.
that's what a lot of business leaders have understood.
Well, and I think it also creates bigger business. So if you're just a old country doctor, like we bemoan disappearing, you can't get a lobbying voice the way Inova Health or Carillion or the University of Virginia Health System can.
Yeah, that's right. It really stands in the way of the small guys. And that's unfortunate because that's really where a lot of innovation comes from.
Mm-hmm. And a lot of the personal care that a lot of people feel is lacking in medicine these days as well. Last one on the subject of certificate of needs, and it's an adjunct really just on a topic that we also find fascinating in medical care is the allowance for direct primary care. Delegate Steve Landis in Virginia was the first one to get a bill passed that would allow for direct primary care associations in Virginia. Terry McAuliffe tried to veto it. It didn't happen, and the bill wound up going through. It's not as strong as it could be, but do these certificate of need laws still get in the way of direct primary care associations?
I don't know if they're a huge barrier to that. What they may do is they might make it difficult for them to make investments. In some states, any kind of a medical investment that is over a certain dollar threshold requires a certificate of need, and so that might stymie them.
Mm.
But I actually, as far as I know, in Virginia, there isn't a requirement, for example, for a certificate of need for a medical office or something like that. So I think this is probably one area that certificate of need laws are not really standing in the way.
Well, Matt, I do appreciate your visit. I hope 2021, I almost feel like saying there's no place we can go but up, but I want to hold my tongue on that before we get into 2021. Thank you for everything that everyone does. The Mercatus Center at George Mason University, an incredible resource, and a university that I hope they never take away the man you're named after, because he was so important to the Bill of Rights and making sure that all the things that God has endowed us with stay intact. But thank you for your visit this week and in the visits to come.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Always a pleasure.
Coming up next, it's Radio on Radio. Carrie Dougherty, the co-host of the Carrie and Mike Show in Norfolk, on the governor's COVID-19 quote-unquote restrictions, next on Freedom and Prosperity Radio.